get started with the next speaker. The people who are in the back of the room, can you get closer, please? Before starting with this panel, I would ask the audience to take their seats. Our speakers are ready. Could you please be quiet? Our last session is on Latin America and the new social order. What is the future for democracy towards 2020? And we have invited a group of experts in politics for the region. Moderating this session, we will have Dr. Lorenzo Córdova, who is counselor for the IFE. Good mornings. Thank you, Manuel, for the introduction on this panel dedicated to reflecting on Latin America and the new social order, the future of democracy towards 2020. And as you can see, it's a panel that has a logics on the light of the reflections and conclusions that we have had in this forum. And in this forum for Latin American democracy, I will be the moderator, and of course the role of inducing the term of intervention to keep everyone to schedule. And besides introducing our distinguished speakers and panel members, the task was to make an initial reflection that more than guiding the reflections would provide context for this panel. I think that since it has been a driving axis throughout the sessions in this forum, I think that equality or inequality, its counterpart and its relationship with democracy is the great theme, the great topic in a lot of Latin American democracies, but I would also dare to say all democracies in the world. And I think that not many times, more than this one, we can live the expression of Tocqueville in America, where he foresaw the unavoidable coming of democracy in the world, given the conditions. Tocqueville, if you remember, when he was talking about democracy in America on the causes that had caused the construction and the settlement of this kind of government in the United States, he talked about the equality of the conditions, and today it's pretty much the opposite, and we could say that is the great matter that has oriented us in this forum. If growing inequality in the world is not one of the main problems faced by the future of said democracies today, like we have been saying in these panels, inequality and poverty are the main challenges faced by democracies, and not only Latin American democracies, but all democracies worldwide. We just need to think about the comments Joseph Stevens talked about the North American or the American society, and inequality that had never been present in the history of the United States. So inequality and poverty is something that not only has to do with our democracies, but with all democracies. And I think that along these lines it's very important to assume that democratization processes are not irreversible, but they tend to cause authoritarian regressions that are way more radical than the ones that were there before the democracy process. This regression is authoritarian, as the history has a lot of examples. Germany in the 1930s, a lot of these regressions throughout last century in Latin America tell us how this abandonment of democracy to go back to authoritarian conditions tends to cause conditions that are a lot worse than the ones that were there before. And taking this into account, the fact of having to solve these de facto situations that maybe some of us used to think that transition through the electoral road would be the solution is a condition without anything equal to try to avoid these regressions, the disenchantment with democracy and its derivation, the credibility crisis in political parties and in the representation institutions, which are the congresses, I agree, are the main fertilizer for these regressions. Now, in the context of inequality and poverty, the potential germination of the involvement and the lack of control of savage powers, legal or illegal powers, public or private powers, powers that are institutionalized, are the main challenge for the future of the democracies. I think along these lines, and this will be my last comment, to listen to our guests, that the risk we face, the great challenge we are facing is not only to revert the poor quality of our democracies, but to inoculate the temptation which is there latent, that our democratic systems would be warped, in which authors such as Michelangelo Bovero would call apparent democracies. And I think these are some of the comments and conclusions that have guided us throughout this forum and these panels, but they also are the main axes through which the reflection on the conclusions throughout this decade and beyond have to solve. And you all know our guests, not only because they are usually participants in this forum, but because they are also personalities of very high international prestige. I will shortly introduce our four panel members. Kevin Casas is a Costa Rican politician. He has been the second vice president and minister of national planning and economic policy in his country. He has also been a programs officer of the ARIS Foundation. He was the general coordinator of the National Human Development Report of Costa Rica, and he's currently the Secretary for Political Affairs at the Organization of American States. We also have Gustavo Palomares, who is one of the leading experts in international relations, especially in the field of cooperation between the European Union and Latin America, as well as he has also been a director of several major state reform projects in Latin America. and he currently chairs the Institute of High European Studies. Welcome, Gustavo. Carlos Mesa is a Bolivian historian, writer, and politician. He has worked on the radio, on TV, and the press. He has produced cinema and television documentaries. He was vice president of his country in 2002 and the president from 2003 to 2005. He is a member of the Bolivian Academy of History and the Bolivian Society of History. And finally, Arturo Núñez, who is he's local, he's Mexican, he's always been here with us. He's a Mexican economist and politician. He has served as Director of Political Development of the Ministry of the Interior, Secretary of the Interior. He was General Director of the Federal Electoral Institute. He has worked with the United Nations as an electoral consultant. He has also been a federal representative and vice president of the Senate. And right now, as you all know, he is currently the governor of the state of Tabasco. So I would ask you to please, I would give the floor to, let's start with Kevin. Thank you very much, Lorenzo, for your introduction. And it is an honor for me to share the panel with all these guests, and it is an honor that I'm very familiar with, because actually last year in this forum I had the pleasure of being with President Mesa and Governor Núñez in a panel that's similar to this one, and now I'm very happy to meet Gustavo. I would also like to thank the IFE for allowing me to be here and for the good initiative of inviting us. And I'm speaking on behalf of the AO and also on behalf of the Colegio de México for hosting this activity, and I would also like to thank a few other people that also, of course, President Valdez from the IFE, who has played a fundamental role in this forum, and in 4 years we needed to be inside this canopy because we didn't fit in the auditorium of the Colegio de México last year. And my good friend Manuel Carrillo, who is one of the fathers of this creature, of the baby. Thank you, Manuel, for all your efforts. And my colleague Moses Benamodes around there, which has played a very important role from the OAS. So we need to thank a lot of people for this event. I will try to focus in the next 10 minutes on the question, on the matter from the panel, on the challenges for Latin American democracy towards 2020. And this means that I'm going to talk less about the world situation and the way it can have an impact on Latin America, which is what is suggested in the reference terms, and I'm going to talk more about the transformations and the challenges that the Latin American democracy will face based on certain characteristics and trends we can see today. And in a very substantive way, I'm going to propose 5 of these characteristics and trends that I think are important to have under the radar. They're not the only ones, but I think they hold important keys to know what we can expect when it comes to the development for the democracy mid-term, such as the year 2020. The first one of these characteristics has to do with the consolidation of certain minimum consensus of what good government in Latin America means. And besides what we read in the press that are always talking about ideological polarization. The truth is that if you take any regional survey, Latinoamericana, the Barometer of the Americas, whatever you want, what we find in the political attitudes of the population of Latin America is a great ideological convection towards the center, which acknowledges as elements of good government at least three things. The first one and the most obvious one is that the power, the legitimate power, is acquired through free, transparent, periodical elections. This is an established consensus. Like Alfred Stephanie, democracy is the only game in town. The second fundamental consensus, and Vice President Astori was talking about is not doing crazy things with the macroeconomical balances, because what we have here in Latin America is very long and very painful. The third consensus is that any government must be able to start robust political, social policies that will have an impact on poverty and inequality. And each one of these transformations is a very profound, very deep change in the culture of Latin America. And I feel they're here to stay. So honestly, when we ask people in Latin America, no one really cares if the ruler is left hand or right hand, as long as they do certain things, as long as they do certain things that are already part of this notion of what we expect from a good government. And I think that's a positive data for democracy. I think those processes are installed right now and will continue to be so into 2020. I'm sure of that. Now, the second characteristic I want to talk about has to do with the transformation of political representation and the crisis of the traditional representation mechanisms. And we've talked about that before. If political parties had a monopoly of political representation in Latin America, they don't anymore. And they don't for a lot of reasons. Because they don't have a lot of credit anymore. When you take any regional survey, you can find that when it comes to credibility, political parties are on the bottom of the scale, underneath any other institution and any other social stakeholder. But also, monopoly of representation has eroded because we have civil societies that are a lot more active and also with more fragmentation. And also it has been eroded because of the emergence of two key stakeholders. One, the media. Have assumed, aware of it, a political representation role which is accepted peacefully by the population, because I'm going to ask a question that's pretty much a rhetorical question. If any of you in your communities have a reivindication that you want to settle for the political power, do you go to the political party's office or do you go to the local TV network? Obviously you go to the TV network. So there's a very powerful stakeholder that is a mediator in the political representation, who are the media. And of suppose we have a social network. Social networking is changing drastically the way we are discussing politics. The citizen is not anymore one who just takes messages from the political class, but they also have their own opinions now. So all these things added up have been taking little pieces on the monopoly of political representation that some political parties used to have, and this leads me to reflect on something that is maybe more in depth. So the question on what is the future of political parties, because in all these discussions we keep saying that it's necessary to strengthen political parties so that they become more representative. And I am under the impression that if you go and ask the young people, the truth is that none of them wants to, or most of them don't want to be a part of a political party. So I ask myself, are political parties a phenomenon of the 20th century? On the same way that certain capitalism institutions have been head over heels, and the Manchester capitalism is obsolete now. So I ask myself, is this what happened to political parties and they refuse to exist? So representation mechanisms that have been created socially overtook the political parties, and they are having a lot of problems when adapting to this change, especially in the role of the media and social networks. So I think it is a task from the political classes and from the academy that we think and write a lot more on this, because this has practical implications. This is not an academic matter. This is an example, and I'm going to say something with the risk of delving into deeper and complicated waters when it comes to the financial situation of our host country. A few days ago, I was talking with some of the people that are responsible for this interesting experiment of the Pact for Mexico, and I had, after this discussion, I had the sensation with all the positive things of this pact, that are many, that they are too sure that society will peacefully accept the consensus agreed upon just by the political parties. And I think that this is a little bit more complex, because the degrees of representation from political parties, not only in Mexico but everywhere, are at least answered from different sides of society.
The third characteristic that I would like to mention as a feature of democracy that is very celebrated has to do with the exhaustion of the constitutional framework. In many cases that have been agreed on during organizations, when we see political crises such as Honduras and Paraguay, we can clearly see that one of the sparking factors has to do with very evident failures of the constitutional framework. And it is not out of luck that we can see political reforms everywhere. We can see them in Mexico, in Brazil, in Chile, Costa Rica. I am afraid that this is going to be a great topic during the next decade. Now, the speed in which we are making these reforms is a very sensitive matter. I have the feeling that in Brazil, with what has been going on in recent times, it's an example that shows the effects of leaving an unavoidable reform for later. On the other hand, there's a great acceleration and trying to impose a political reform without thinking the consequences as we should. This could also be a problem. The fourth characteristic has to do with the growing emptiness of the rule of law in Latin America. Once again, when we have a perception of insecurity in Latin America, independently of what the figures show, there is a growing and high stability, and this has great and very serious consequences. Nearly 40% of Latin American population is able to accept corruption as long as they fight against crime. Some of them are willing to accept that they can take justice in their own hands. They are not taking into consideration. People are have been very expressive about this in this region, and I think this is very dangerous. And I'm not going to go into detail, but when we are doing a test, an assessment of how we are facing, how citizens are facing these insecurity situations, they are either adapting their behaviors from one side, or they are becoming more tolerant of authorities' abuse of power. And here we have the content of rule of law. They are starting to accept this corruption and disorder, and I think this is very serious. I am sure we have mentioned this in earlier days. The fifth characteristic is the very accelerated proliferation of social demands. There are greater middle classes. There are great expectations of the future. I read yesterday that over 60% of the Brazilian population, based on the decades in the past decade, has some favorable expectations with regards to their future. And at the same time, we have a great amount of problems talking about the tax capacity of the state to provide for public services, and we have even greater problems in the capacity of the state to provide public goods and services that the population is demanding. I have an example that I think is very serious, and it's that of Brazil, which explains very clearly what has been happening recently. In these discussions, once again, we are all insisting on the need of Latin America to increase tax levies, but we are trying to do that to provide for the needs of the population. And then we have the case of Brazil, in which they have a great tax imposition of 33 to 37% of the GDP, and in some cases they have third world public services. They have a tax collection of the first world, but they have services of the third world. The question here is, when we're doing this very legitimate demand of increasing the tax levies, we must make sure that this translates into better services and goods that are public, because this translation is not automatic. So we have 5 characteristics that I think are very likely in Latin America for 2020. A democracy in some senses that is more consolidated, but is also more researched for, and this makes us think of the regimes that are living and going through accelerated process of change. Thank you, Lorenzo. this subject, I would like to thank the Federal Electoral Institute, especially to Dr. Valdez and Dr. Carrillo for their opportunity given to me to share my insights in this fourth forum, especially in this Colegio de Mexico, which for us the Spanish people is going back home because of the political and significance of this institution. And doing this at a historic moment that is of utmost importance. And for a person that has also had the responsibility of assuming what has been going on in this panel, that is to make a kind of fiction, political fiction of what we may be able to find between 2020 and 2030. The work that the Federal Electoral Institute is doing is basic and it's fundamental, because in this forum and this panel in specific, we are continuing with the works of all the agents in the international community, because we're trying to set out which should be the new political and economic objectives, so we can set out new instruments and new commitments. And I believe that this is a fundamental element. It's not a matter of political fiction, but of trying to advance instruments that for a country such as Mexico are going to be fundamental to face the challenges in economic and political matters at an international, national, and global level. From this point of view, I think this is an exercise that should be carried out so that we can also cross our agendas, which is the objective that I have here. We must combine agendas and to set out which environments within a triangulation exercise of the shared values which are necessary so that two regions such as Latin America and the European Union follow this strategic alliance that they have made from quite some time. If I should give an answer to the first question set out by Dr. Carrillo, and that has been advanced by his brilliant work team, what is the possible scenario that we can find in 2020? I would like to remember one of our hypothesis after I came from China 3 days ago. It was the work period that we had in the 90s. We used to say that China was going to be able to take this economic and commercial leadership that is substantial and important. It's going to become a new engine, and it's also going to be able to do the internal transformations that imply not only being the new international engine, but being the market that also implies becoming a reference, a model, not just for Asia, but for the rest of the world. Today we can give an answer to this hypothesis that was set out at the end of the 90s, and we can say yes. The 2020-2030 agenda says that China is going to be a fundamental player, and the Asian continent is going to be a reference of where all the efforts in economic and trade and financial matters should be oriented, and also the political objectives. The figures of the International Monetary Fund are very important. The GDP of China, Brazil, and India right now in 2010 is identical to the GDP of the most advanced powers. It's identical to those to the GDP of the US, Germany, Canada, Canada and Italy. I would even go further into saying that for the European people, it's also an element of learning. In the 2020 horizon, out of the 5 most important economies in the world, 4 are going to be developing countries: Brazil, China, Russia, and India. The other is going to be the U.S. We are not going to have a European Community country within the 5 most powerful countries in the world. Even more, in the 2050 forecast, the added GDP of China, Brazil, and India are going to add up to 20% more than the added GDP of the Western developed economies, and they're going to represent 40% of the world production. An important fact for the Latin American continent in 2020, out of the 15 most important economies, 3 are going to be those in Latin America: Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. And on the horizon for 2050, if such developing countries and economies, we add that of Mexico and Turkey, this is going to represent 25% more in the production that Western economies that are the most developed can have. Now that we've seen the panorama in trade and economic matters, we can take into account that these developing countries have the greatest debt from countries in the whole world. Right now, they are the most indebted. The main question that has to do with our panel is, does this political, economical, and commercial leadership will be corresponding to a political leadership? Those countries that are going to progressively have this economic and commercial leadership will represent the classic statement that the power of a state is that which we get from its military, political, and economic powers. And this is important to make these 2 hegemonies that are referenced for the 2020 and 2030 agenda that are going to be Mexico and Brazil. Brazil and Mexico will have to have the will to take this political power, to break a tradition of their foreign policies that used to be good kids that didn't break a glass, that didn't misbehave, or that didn't hurt or cause malady for its neighbors. This is a key element that I believe is there in the search for new instruments. Mexico should be building this step by step. In this scenario, what should be the backdrop for Latin America between 2020 and 2030? Throughout this forum, we have gone through different elements that could be this answer. And it's going to let us to share some analysis not only of our research groups, but of the work that the experts and academics have established in the European Union, not only of causal models that have been left behind by the political science, but of some of the fundamental trends that Latin America could have after seeing what is the behavior of the last 5 years, and what are those challenges within these backdrops that we are necessarily going to have to face in the next years. First of all, I would like to say there are good news. Good news means that this trend of Latin America, that has taken Latin America towards a better position within the states that are the most developed, seems to be affirmed. And we're confirming this in elements that are going to work to define democracy. We cannot define democracy from other points of view or environments that don't have to do with human development. From this point of view, democracy serves an important role for the citizenship that has to manage. There is a trend in which we are confirming fundamental advance in fighting poverty. With this stigma that it is still ongoing in spite of the advances, especially on the shared objectives in the current scenario and in the future scenario. There are going to be great advances in this fight against poverty. In two environments, I would like to point out some advances in public policies, especially in those regarding health and education. We have had some advances that are significant, and I'm sure we're going to have some fundamental advances by 2020 or 2030. However, we're still seeing a weakness that we should foresee at the moment of establishing continuous elements in these public policies of health and education. Since as we have compared from here, these advances may be irreversible. We can set situations that are proportional directly to the economic development regards to backwardnesses that could happen in the public policies environments on health and education. Thus, this is a call to Latin American states to set out not only continuance policies, but to set out fundamental environments of state policies first than political party interests. And these elemental values have to do with this bad news. Bad news are that by 2020, 2030, there seems to be that there's going to be great inequality in our continent, especially in social assistance, which has been, there may be some development like that time frame, but the bad news is that it seems that there's serious risks of institutionalizing inequality in the Latin American continent. This is undoubtedly a key element that we should keep in mind when structuring new instruments. In this structuration of new instruments, I allow myself to make some suggestions that are directly related to what the keynote speech of Dr. Astoria has confirmed this morning. First of all, in this 2020-2030 horizon, there seems to be a need to foster states that are committed and responsible. I believe that it is moment to take a step in this debate where we have gone from minimal states from a neoliberal period of time from this to this present time to make a question: what states are sufficient in this time frame of 2020-2030, where we have to break this institutionalization of inequality? And I ascribe to the version of some of the suggestions that have to do with defining not only citizenship, a citizenship that is smart, but the search for a state that is intelligent in Latin America for this time frame. The intelligence of a state in this period should be no other than having a great social management in the structuration of public policies, imposing public policies that are resistant, that have continuance and continuity, and that assure and guarantee social inclusion and assure the main objective of the Latin American states, that is the search for social cohesion. Before the inequality in income of the Latin American society, which we have to manage, and we're going to have to manage. We need states that manage and are accountable for their acts, but also the accountability of private sectors. We need states that take a leap both in quantity and quality of establishing new public policies. These new public policies are undoubtedly going to make a reference to citizenship. We need to institutionalize new spaces for the Latin American citizenship. This means not only having to create a new citizen pact, because Latin American states with the citizenship will conform the greatest engine of our society and of our future. We will now listen to President Mesa. Thank you very much for the chance of my second chance of being in this fourth forum. My impression is that the fundamental deficit in our democracy is that of the lack of building a citizenship. Latin America has built a democratic structure with all the elements that we have greatly developed and talked about in these sessions. However, it hasn't been able to sustain this democracy. And an idea of citizenship as a responsibility, as an obligation, and as a commitment of the citizen towards the state, as an element of that what is necessary to define the reality of a democratic state. As citizenship is built, I believe, beginning with those who are owners of the future, who are at this moment between 15 and 38 years old. The owners of our future belong to a transformation process that's historical, that is changing the parameters of understanding of how are we going to organize ourselves to work as a civilized way, as a society. The owners of the future, that are the youth, have set some questions that have a different nature, both in the instrumental and conceptual levels. Beginning in the 21st century, transformed into the 23rd century because of the simultaneity and acceleration. We can see very evident in technologies such as smartphones and computers, because we have the possibility that our thought is regulated by the movement of our palms. The possibility of being instantly connected to another person, but at the same time a reality that has been defined yesterday very clearly in one of the sessions. We have a horizon that seems gray, in which opportunities are not clear, and in which there is a marriage that is very deep between daily life and violence. Right? Violence is not an element that we don't know of. It is not an exceptional element. It is not an anomaly. It is part that is incorporated to the daily life, sometimes more intensively in the youth of today than in the youth of the past. Not because there is a pretension of today's youth to be more violent than those in the past, but because of the possibilities and the developing of the change in the code of values and in the reformulation of how we understand life. Daily life of people that goes to the university, to nightclubs, to work. This life is filled with violence, and there's a collection of values that are substituting another set of values that we could define as anti-values. But that the youth are not necessarily reading as anti-values. We are living a process of transformation in which we are combining an unprecedented revolution in technological matters and our communication means as humans. At the same time, when the collective behaviors of what was good and what was bad. This reality sets some deep questions. How, from the politics and then the construction of a democratic model, can we then transmit the idea of responsibility of citizenship if we cannot communicate with those citizens of the future? In general terms, the mind of the democracy today is analogical, and it's transmitting values and concepts to digital minds. This has to do not only with the meaning, but with the fundamentals of the ideas. The owners of the future should be the main actors in these actions. Youth communities should be at the center of ideas, of generating policies, because this is going to allow us to understand how we're going to transform politics. That will let us understand how does a political party work, because our new generations don't understand how this works. How taking this both thinking comes action transforms into a political action that we have separated from because we have an analogical mind. I'm doing a metaphor, of course, against a digital mind. The basic challenge, the youth has to be at the core of decisions. Women, another basic challenge, women should be at the core of the decision making. The indigenous people should be at the core of this decision making. Not only subjects of figures, but actual subjects that are making decisions. We have to pool generations and bringing decision making accessible. It is a paradox because the young generations are living very difficult moments to become part of a society. The problem that we have is not just the quality of education, but we should have an education that is oriented to what the society is demanding and not to what the challenges that we had in the 19th and 20th century in Latin America. This is one of the first key factors that I think should be taken into account. The second factor has to do with climate change, makes reference to tangible elements. Mexico has been going through a dramatic situation in the last days because we are facing a great financial challenges due to the natural disasters. Natural disasters are going to become constant, and it's going to represent a great bleeding of the resources, and it's going to be defining not only contingency policies but structural policies, because they seem to be sporadic, but they are now becoming constant. Of course, this sets answer from Latin America to climate change problems. It's not just a matter of a harmony between man, nature, and animals. We need to have a process that is transforming our priorities and our challenges. I'm not go further with what is evident already, but we are lacking in correct orientation to solve inequality. But I think that this is a phenomenon that is overseen. We are talking about a future in which we are going to have a great bleeding of resources and efforts, and the credibility of the capacity of the state to solve these problems. The third element that I think is key, and I agree completely with Gustavo, Latin America is no longer a continent that doesn't have a meaning. Because it's neither good nor bad. Latin America is an important continent. Gustavo has given important figures. Brazil and Mexico are global players, but I think that the third player isn't going to be Argentina, but Colombia, because its population has growth and they have a growth in GDP, and because they have designed political policies that are more efficient than that of Argentina. But that is irrelevant for this purpose. We are talking about Latin America that is main actor, and this means as a key player in globalization, in a sense that we are going to play a role that is going to be defining the collective destiny. And I agree, Mexico and Brazil should lead Latin American leadership for the interests of the whole region, which is going to be eventually contradictory. And any leadership is going to have positive and negative impact. Any leadership leadership has going to have additions and problems that are going to have to be solved by those two powers because they have to agree how they're going to see Latin America. In this context, I think that we should go into we're entering a scenario with problems that are now greater than Asia, Europe, or Latin America. They're going beyond their specificities, and these specificities should be taken into account into internal developments. What I mean is that we will have more partial sovereignties and we'll have less general sovereignties. Partial sovereignty is a local level, and they should be taking measures of policies that are facing climate change and that have some changes to the long term. A complementary effect that has to do with the conception of democracy. If it's true that Asia is a leader in building the future and that the global GDP will be greatly linked to the economic development of Asia, it will also be true that the universalization of the democratic process has to be questioned. China will transform its role model to that of the Western world, or we will have different complementary or contradictory answers on how we understand democracy.
India, they have their own conditions. Yesterday we had a very interesting speech that it is the largest democracy in the world, but with challenges that will eventually be attention on. So the conclusion is our look on the universalization of democracy today can be transformed because the ones that are the financial and economical engine can change. I'm not sure about the military leadership. The United States, of course, is the first power in the world. It is the most important military power in the world, and they are not willing to lose that role. Maybe by 2016 they will be the second largest economy in the world, but in 2016 and 2020 and 2030 they plan to be the number one military economy in the world. And this has to do with the construction of values. This has to do with the idea of what the world has to do or must not do. And Latin America is not exempt of this. So there's also an idea that I think is basic to build a Latin American reason of being that will allow us to strengthen participation, citizenship, structuring of political models from emphasis. I agree with the story. The word model is not ideal. I'm not using it great. I think it's just a step by step. I close the parentheses and go back to my speech. Latin America is pre-Hispanic, indigenous, and non-exclusive Occidental characteristics that can have an influence on our democratic aspects. So we will be able to build on this Western tradition to enriching our view of the future. So these possibilities defend just one logic. We must have two main objectives. One, to build a citizenship as a responsibility. Number two, to understand that construction or that building of citizenship with responsibility and obligations and not only with rights must be built by the owners of the future, who we talk about often, who we understand very little, and who we haven't given the role they need to play in this stage in order to build a vigorous democracy by 2020. Thank you very much. Thank you, President Mesa, and now we will have Arturo Núñez. Thank you for the invitation to the IFE, to the OES, to the Fondo Cultura, to Arpía Internacional. I am very glad to share the forum with the rest of the panel members, and just as Kevin I would like to talk about a few things. Dante Caputo coordinated with the document Governing the Future, Latin American Scenarios Towards 2020, and I think this is very useful for our conclusions and reflections, and we have had a few questions we must answer in this panel regarding Latin America and the new social order. What are the democracy challenges moving towards 2020? And we are supposed to talk about ideologies in this scenario analysis. I'd like to say that there's many ways of talking about the future. One of them is from the point of view of the social scientist that wants to make a diagnosis through the definition of scenarios, but I would like to talk about the political party program that gathers the science and technology and also the political commitment and the promise when it comes to the social and political aspects. I would really much like to talk about three topics regarding the future of the Latin American democracy. One that has to do with the state or with the government, another one with social networks, and another one with social inequality. I think that George Bordeaux in his political science treaty around the 60s or 70s, he was saying that the state arises from the massification of the press, and that allows the abstract thought in order to deposit for the first time in humankind political power in an abstract body. And until then, the power belonged to very few people. It was a personalized power, but it became an institutional power, and its officers executed every now and then, but really the state is the owner. And now, in the times of, like Sartori says, the man who sees doesn't read so much. The state faces several challenges, the ones that come from outside the borders with the savage financial markets, with the anchors of globalization, with social pathologies that do not respect national borders, including criminology, but also the challenges from inside, the efforts to decentralize the powers in the countries, and for the claims of many new sectors. But I would like to highlight the challenge that comes from what is happening in a process with which the known borders between the public and the private sectors is being erased, is becoming hazy. And mainly due to the action of the stakeholders that day in and day out take advantage of the new technologies, new IT technologies, and that also are a challenge for the state. And from that standpoint, it's not only from economics and politics, but also, like in all institutions, the state faces the challenges of scientific and technological evolution, of this change in the civilization that has to do with what Vargas Llosa calls the civilization of the show business. So talking about social networks, they are creating a great revolution within the empowerment of the citizen in order to build a public space. And during a while, especially for us that are the people of my generation, the written press, the radio, the TV, were the ways, and still continue to be, until some issue, the ones that the tools we used to build the public space. And we were saying that we needed to go to a network channel like the new summit of democracy. However, there is something incipient in social networks where people don't need to have money to access the traditional media. You just need to have a computer and have internet access to contribute in the construction of public spaces. Of course, we still have to refine and fine-tune this with social networking as they control themselves. And nowadays, everyone can have the same access, and we have a lot of information, sometimes useless, does not have a hierarchy and has not been proven, which implies not having ethical references that have been built throughout the traditional media. And also with the demands of competition that would kick out of competition the ones that would not respect the rules of the media. And we've always heard that the facts are sacred but opinion is free, and now social network facts and opinions are interlinked and create a universe that even though they create an empowerment for society to create public spaces, they also are a great risk for democracy. A friend of mine, who was the director of the first national newspaper, Socorro Díaz Palacio, who is currently, she says that the one who is not confused, it means this person is not well informed. And we also need to talk about something that is mentioned in the Caputo document, that even though we have had very good stages in Latin American society, we still have social inequality beyond the social problems. The problems in the market, social inequality creates a great citizenship deficit in Latin American countries, and derived from this, a deficit in institutionality. And I agree that it is necessary to build citizenship, and this implies at least to mitigate social inequality, which is a structural constant in Latin American realities, which has an impact on the construction of democracy towards 2020, which is really just around the corner. And of course, we need to remember with Merlino leading the change, the political change, that political regimes change from authoritarianism to democracy, but also vice versa. When some elements fail in one case or another, and the efficacy of public policies when it comes to legitimacy, management, and results is fundamental for democracy. If we don't have this, of course, we have the risk of going back to the authoritarian regimes that would mean a lack of results of public policies, and also military threat in many cases. So I think we have to rebuild the state. Mr. Fukuyama acknowledged it in his book, The Reconstruction of the State in Latin America, even though with an American vision, or with an American-centered vision, according to which we surpass the neoliberal establishment of this, because in Latin America we have a great impact on Latin America with migration, terrorism, and drug dealing. I'm not so worried about the realities of the countries, but they are not worried about this, but more about the effect this will have in America. Of course, we will need to achieve the fact that the social networks will go through a depuration stage for this generation of digital mentality, like President Mesa was saying, and we also need to mitigate social inequality if we want to face a firm democratic consolidation from here to 2020. Thank you very much. Arturo, thank you very much. We have a large amount of questions. I would like to talk about some of the topics. We would like to answer each and every one of them, but we don't have enough time for this. So I would like to take just the ones that are more common, and I wouldn't like to be a moderator in this last part of the panel, but a provoker. I would like to provoke the answers and the opinions from the panel members. We have several questions that are focused on planning the role of political parties in this future scenario of democracy from different points of view. On the one hand, from the control political parties have had on institutions, state-owned institutions that should be institutions that would control politics, but especially from the role they will have, and this is my comment, not from the questions, that I think it is they are mechanisms that are paramount to create a consensus. So I think that without the presence of political parties, it's hard to imagine democracy. That I would say to think in a democracy without parties is a product of evolution or hypocrisy, but maybe I'm still anchored in the lessons from the last century. But the great challenge we have is what do we need to do to have democracy in a context without political parties or political parties that are being diminished. So maybe, and this is again my comment, what we will have tomorrow will be something different and not necessarily democracy, because regardless of the progress of social networks, I am under the impression that these are not a substitute of the role of political parties as creator of consensus. And I would also like to say that before the democracy challenges that have been put on the table, we've been also talking about the institutional or constitutional package to face these challenges, which I think is paramount to face these public policies of inclusion, of fighting inequality, but also to empower the citizens. So the question is, along these lines, the provocation is, how can we save or rescue and strengthen traditional institution of modern constitutionalism before the democratic aspects that come with the futuristic expressions and anti-institutional expressions. So along these lines, we have received a lot of questions that question more depth on the road or the route that these policies must take on the young people. And just like President Mesa was saying, these young people are the people who will transform or will create change. So what will happen to these empowering policies for young people as a route to strengthen democracy and citizenship. And finally, I would like to summarize another set of questions regarding this paradox, how to face this paradox of a region that will play a very important role in the next few years, both because of the economic growth, but also because it is an important stakeholder in globalization, but with the great paradox of not advancing in social matters. So I would say, is this a condition to play this role to solve these social problems and inequality problems? An element that is very important to determine to land this protagonic role which this region will play in the future. I will start with the same order of the speeches, and if you can, Kevin can talk for 5 minutes about these questions. Thank you, Lorenzo. Well, see, I don't think I will be able to answer all these questions because they are very complex and very delicate. I will talk about a couple of them. Political parties. Okay, let's see. Don't take me wrong. I am a firm believer on the fact that we need to strengthen political parties. But what I am saying is that I have increasing reasonable doubts on the usefulness of our efforts to do this. This thing that we have to empower and strengthen political parties, I've been hearing it for the last at least 20 years, and what we have seen every day in all measurements of public opinion is that people have less and less credibility in political parties. That every day, few people want to be a part of a political party, even though that participation and that will to belong to a political party used to be what gave them a social position. And just out of scientific curiosity, I would like to make that experiment here. The audience we have here is an audience that is interested politically, otherwise they wouldn't be here. How many of you, please raise your hand, how many of you, especially the ones that are at the back, that I think it's the younger people, the students, how many of you are participants or militants in a political party or would like to be today? Okay, that's the answer. That's the answer for you. So the thing here is not if political parties are desirable instruments for social interests and demands. Everybody agrees on that, I think. But the thing is, if facing the future, we will have to live with a society that wants to do this. A society in which political parties will not be able to have these interests even though they want to have them. How or who will substitute these political parties? I don't know. I don't have that information, but what I would like to do is to state that political parties might experience what other institutions have experienced. And this is not only a problem for the political parties. Political parties, at the end of the day, are an instrument to exercise power, and one of the trends that are more powerful nowadays worldwide is the spreading out, the diffusion of the power. So I think there's a very important in-depth evolution and reflection that goes beyond just repeating like a mantra that we have to strengthen political parties because this is the only way of creating or making democracy possible. We have to do this, but I'm not sure we will be successful. I'm not sure we'll be successful. So the thing about the protagonic role or the important role of Latin America, I will be very honest, this is something that gives me kind of a rash because I don't believe in those historical statements, and I don't think that any region is condemned or destined to success and prosperity, just like Vice President Astori said wisely, is an important value. Prosperity is something that is built, that is created. And I think that the pending tasks of Latin America are very considerable, very large. We have come a long way. We have made some important achievements, and none more. But probably the most important one has been building democracies that kind of work with their highs and their lows, and that are a lot better than authoritarian calamities that preceded them. So we have done very important things, but I'm not sure Latin America can assume a leading role as long as they still have the public educational system that are so bad that we have nowadays, that puts us at the bottom of any scale of any measurement of the quality of education worldwide. So I don't think Latin America will be able to play this leading role if we continue to invest what is being invested in development and research. Brazil, which is the only Latin American country that invests in R&D over 1%, they invest 25% of what Israel invests. Guatemala has today the same number of patents per million inhabitants that Yemen has, which is pretty much a failed state. So you don't have to be a genius to realize that our countries will face serious problems to adapt to the 21st century. So that thing about the leading role, I will be very careful with that, because I think that it tends to appear that the loads we have are lighter than what they really are. The tasks we are facing are very large, and some of the tools we have, the instruments we have to build them, such as political systems, in many cases are not fit to solve these problems and to face these challenges. Gustavo, please. Well, I think that at least I wouldn't say a crisis of power from the citizens with regards to the democratic quality and with regards to the political parties we have nowadays. I think it's a global shared problem that has to do a lot with that serious transformation of those classic political parties that have distance themselves from the social demands. I also think because this machinery, this internal machinery has caused political parties to be more occupied in their day-to-day activities, and that those great social matters maybe for them are not the most important thing. So along these lines, it's very important that political parties must undergo a serious transformation, assuming that citizens will judge them not from the standpoint of the ideological position they hold, but from the vision of social usefulness they can have with regard to the great commitments each one of the countries might have. Along these lines, I think that a paramount activator of the reform of political parties is citizen or social contribution. And I remember some speeches on how the citizen participation matters, even regardless of political parties. So I think an activator of these reforms of political parties is this, to have a social voice that would ask for internal changes within our political institutions, and one of them has to do with Lorenzo, the second thing you were talking about, which is building public policies. I think it's unavoidable, a severe, important transformation in the construction of the formulation of our public policies. And for this, we have two main elements to build these public policies. We must establish dialogue tables to establish this. But this has to be a permanent element, not temporary, a permanent element that defines these policies. These forms of dialogue in which we have to have the central state, the government, other levels like municipalities and states, but also the citizen participation that has not found political institutionalization. We have to get the voice from the citizens that is not expressed exclusively through political parties, but that have an increasingly more important role on our states and society. So along these lines, I think the formulation of public policies that goes from down low to up high, that so they are not only a temporary exercise, but they are an ongoing exercise, and they are permanently under citizen observation. I think is a very important element. And I would want to share the only point, which is probably the only point that I have seen simultaneously in all global political agendas, whether it be in these Western societies with more economic crisis or with less economic crisis. I would also dare to say in those agendas that have to do with Asian states, and this is that so shared point in all agendas has to do with the weakness we have when it comes to young people employment. And this is a dramatic situation. Yesterday Karina was talking about this, because this means that our public policies have to aim necessarily to the creation of a fundamental future. Our bet to create future capacities has to go through public policies that have to do with this shared and common point in all agendas. Can you imagine? I come from a state in which more than 30% of young people, even if they studied a BA or not, they are unemployed. But also, I come from other kinds of societies. I come from China and from other Asian countries in which they have to manage a process of polarization associated with young people employment. So we have people with more flexible agreements, or that new slavery that is linked to employment of young people. We're talking about continental leadership. I agree completely 100% with Kevin. It's impossible to see Latin American leadership with the level of equality institutionalization you can find in the 2020-2030 agenda, which might continue to increase with the levels of education we have, with the fundamental education we have with regards to several public policies. This leadership has to go through a model of new bets. And I think Mexico and Brazil have to bed this morning. Mr. Arturo was saying they have to be taking new commitments commitment, the values in this new commitment cannot be one, cannot be other than getting the sense of equality that is the sense, the thing that gives sense to democracy. And I think we have lost that value. And what provides a value to democracy is just the principle of equality, a fundamental trend that, and all our countries have to walk that path to have these social inclusion societies.
Now we'll listen to Carlos Mesa. I must restate my total conviction, the democratic values based on the classical Republican perspective and even liberal perspective. However, after saying this, I think it is unavoidable and it is necessary to say that we are in a transformation process that is global, and that it has to do with the end of Eros centrality as a conception of values and a conception of the building of the infrastructure of our democratic behavior. This shift from Eurocentrism will not deny what the Western world has given to this debate, but it allows us to be flexible in the conception that we can broaden the Republican ideas in such a logical and orthodox idea as the one that we have today. Second of all, we are trapped in words such as left-wing, right-wing, central parties. The word party takes us immediately to the usual meaning. I have no doubt that a political party is a necessary element in democracy, but I am also very aware that this way of understanding a political party as we have understood it up till now is no longer working. Consequently, we have to make a shift from our interpretation of the political party idea, not of the importance of the political party as a mediation instrument, to complement the idea that a political party is a necessary instrument and that there are some new technological mechanisms that the new world is setting to us. We have to marriage mental ideas, not to say that we have to reform political parties. What we have to do is to make a conception of a political party that meets the challenges that I made reference to with regards to the owners of the future. We have to find answers in this population and the way in which we will structure their participation platforms, which have to be built by these very owners of the future, who will be defining a completely different definition of a political party in how they build it, but not in the concept per se, to strengthen democracy. I would like to insist in what is going to happen in a world in which the main powers will not be focused in the West. What is going to happen in how we look and how we face our challenges? And this is adds to what I was saying earlier of broadening the concept of democracy beyond the Western values, which I still think that are necessary and essential. A remark on violence. The reading that we are doing on how to face violence is based on values. Probably this, and especially these values aren't changing because they have to do with human nature. This is good and bad. But the way in which we are approaching how we understand and how we live violence may be mistaken. It is clear that the basic confrontation to organized crime and all that this implies must be done in a way that is different to that which we have followed up today. Even we have to put into question those values that seem to be sacred and that seem to be more based in our religion and moral than in ethics. I don't have a clear answer to do a definition and the limit of these two, but there is one. Because it is clear in that the religious element is giving us some answers, while the construction of moral or ethical analysis with regards to public health matters has to find a meeting point that meets the challenges of the state. Violence is a dramatic problem, which I think we are understanding in a wrong way, and to which we are giving mistaken answers, because the parameters to face it are with the way in which the society of the 21st century is living them. A reflection on the concerns that Kevin is sharing. Leadership. I agree. If we don't have an education, which we have a very worst education, and if we don't have technology and innovation, it is going to be very difficult to build an adequate leadership. This does not undermine that leadership is something to which the greatest countries of Latin America are condemned. They are heavy. They have to undertake the leadership they have to undertake, because they will have it. This is unquestionable due to the size of these economies, which have to do with taking Latin America to an international and global scenario. Maybe there are contradictions or challenges that should be met. However, this leadership should give an answer even in its insufficiencies, and this of course doesn't have to do with leadership. When we're talking about the paradox of our life or our social construction, of our poverty, this won't be solved because of this leadership, but they would be at the core of the decision making in 10 to 15 years. I have no doubt of this. To our final remark, the construction of future has to be done by those of us who are in a generation a generation that is just ending, or to a new generation, or by those who are owning this future. If we don't take the necessary measures, we're not going to have good results. Now more than ever, because today more than ever, we are living conceptual and instrumental changes that are consistent with the profundity that we have lived right now. I would like to refer to the topic of political parties. I believe that the crisis that we have been talking, the particular crisis of the political parties has to do with the political representation that have arisen from technological status of about 2 to 3 centuries ago, and that are now facing challenges of a new technological status. However, within the technological status in which these political parties were conceived and developed to the point where they are now experimenting, let's remember how Klaus Bonheime used to state that political parties were repudiated by the state, then were annoyed by the state, then they were accepted, recognized, then they were elevated to a constitutional state, but they ended up being recipients of the state. Now, the political parties are facing a challenge that is more similar to representative states. It's not exclusive to political parties, because we are facing a crisis of a change of technological state, of a new horizon. All in all, we have not yet invented in this new technological status something that may substitute political parties, so we have to consider them a necessary malady for the democracy, and we have to acknowledge them as necessary instruments. In Mexico, we have a saying that we talk about a party, how we enjoy the party. In the case of Mexico, the democratic tradition meant going from a hegemonic process to a system to a partidistic system. We saw some nations in Latin America who had to destroy their traditional systems but haven't have a shift to strong systems. But we're talking about a partidary system in which for the first time, thanks to the Pacto por Mexico, are now trying to discuss the limited and restricted rules that give access to political power, which are the elections, to the exercise of public power, which will be the culmination of this democratic tradition, which is still incomplete for many, many reasons here in Mexico. From my point of view, the political parties are effectively in need of transformation according to the new realities. They have evolved from limited parties to a party of masses. Nowadays we're talking about professional parties, and its lack of credit has to do also with what the members of these parties have done. Let's remember what Churchill said. The bellicosity is it's organized in this world wars, civil wars, and wars within parties. Of course, the behaviors within the parties have affected its prestige, and lots of wrong things happen within parties, but they have also been subject to the neoliberal thought, in a sense of the state kind of way. And political parties are a great component of the state, but they have also, for these reasons, been discredited from the outside, because as long as parties are discredited from the outside, they have no other way out but having the factual powers which are not publicly visible, to which the democratic institutionality is demanding. Even recognizing the exhaustion of being in a different technological state, or what the members of the parties are doing against their very own parties, while we don't create something that is better, we must strengthen political parties because they are representative institutions. Another thing, personalized leaderships and caudillo leaders that are very known, widely known in Latin America. We have to say there are many parties that follow this caudillo pattern, but we should temper this caudillo leadership to avoid that the factual powers are the ones that are finally imposed. Otherwise, the port of arrival, such as Mexico, will not be a democratic construction in which we imagine, at least those members of my generation, but a 48% of poor citizens, and an informal economy that has a greater amount of jobs than the formal economy, migrants, criminality. This is not something that we dreamed on, and this has to do with rethinking of what a political party can be and should be. Thank you, Arturo. To pretend to make a global conclusion that synthesizes all the different insights have caused regarding to the challenges of the democracy in the future, that would be a very, I could say it's a promise that we cannot comply with. So I will not make any promises that I know I can't comply with. So I will just make a conclusion, a final remark in just a couple of minutes that tries to sum up and be a final conclusion of what we've seen in this panel. I believe that there's an agreement that is important, in that we should rethink democracy under the light of the challenges that democracy itself is presenting us. But I believe that this should be done from an irreducible perspective, doing so with a waterproofing of authoritarian positions. democratization is facing many challenges. Some of them are particularly appealing, but that have some consequences that may be uncertain. But that doesn't mean they aren't particularly appealing. We have talked a lot about the role of the media, of the role of social networks. And I believe that rethinking democracy in view of what the social networks and new mediums are setting, it's necessary. But it is also certain that the mobilizations that we have seen caused by the social networks, such as the Arabic Spring, show us that these movements do not necessarily end up in democratic solutions. But trying to be reactive or trying to avoid this completely evident reality would be absurd. But we have to do this by channeling this into a model that lets us strengthen democracy instead of fighting it. However, a key element in this line of thought is, as we have said here, the strengthening of citizenship, particularly of those who will be the future, the youth. Unavoidably, this takes us through a logic of involving people and not making them go away from it. This appears to me means capacity and ability of involving them, but also of building public policies that let us from one side face the great problems of democracy, those which we have been exist in this forum: inequality and poverty, and I would say that also the concentration, the monopolistic concentration of the media, and the lack of accountability that we still experience, so that in the future we can say that the anticipations for Latin America could not just be futuristic, but that it's a prophecy that actually occurs. If we don't do it, it appears to me that in a few years, that role that we had in the first of the last century, those commitments not complied by democracy, I hope that this will not only be the ending chapter of a book, but the whole book. The key to achieve this, and maybe I'm anticipating what Manuel is going to say for the topic of the fifth forum. This goes through the logic of rights and of the controlling institutions of power and of the rights themselves. To sum this up, I believe we have an agenda for the future, and I think it is the responsibility of all to channel it correctly so we avoid that the politics fall in overflowing, and that we end up in the democratization of our societies. And maybe I have a very ordinary final remark to say, and we have had perspectives from a very high level, so I'm just going to give a very ordinary thought. Maybe this happens by trying to understand that the greatest problems of democracy are no longer in the electoral level. We should always rethink electoral matters. The rules of access to the power should be pertinent. Those challenges are such that they are forcing the electoral system to be updated, to update also the rules and the processes of elections. I believe we have said here in unanimous agreement that we have to face the greatest challenge of democracy in the future, the greatest problems that are not here. The problems are in the structural problems of our society, which are not going to solve, I am very sorry to say, through the electoral means. We need to forget about this game of going through the electoral matters, but we need to look into the future, and just going round and round on these electoral topics. I believe it's a very delicate and complicated way of not facing the true challenges of democracy, which are the ones that we have talked about in this forum. I would like to thank, on behalf of all the summoning institutions, the participation of our dear panelists, and I would invite you for a brief recess to begin with our final session, named Political Agreements and Democratic Governance. Thank you very much. Thank you for your participation.